On the 25th of September 2005, the battle for the Formula One World Championship was over. In the third to last round, it would be Fernando Alonso who would pick up his first world title in a year where Renault managed to dethrone the stranglehold that Ferrari and Michael Schumacher had upon the championship. This was Fernando Alonso's moment, and he was living it up. He had earned every bit of that championship, and after returning as a manufacturer in 2002, Renault were now on top of the world, in no small part thanks to this guy. But the drive to secure that title that afternoon wasn't exactly the greatest race to ever exist in Formula One ever. Matter of fact, it wasn't even the best that year. See, while the world was celebrating a brand new world champion and the end of any real interest in that year's championship, at the next round, just 2 weeks later, the Formula One circus was about to bestow the world with one of its greatest ever races in its history, and it would come about in one of the more unexpected places. The Suzuka circuit had been the home of Formula One in Japan since that Grand Prix returned to the calendar in 1987. And while it certainly is one of the best driver circuits on the entire calendar, and it definitely had some history, it wasn't exactly a hotbed for great racing. And it still kind of isn't. Most were expecting a sort of atypical race that you would get in the early 2000s. Truly trains, Mercedes engine explosions, and Takuma Sato ramming into anything that moved. But as fate would have it, only one of those things would occur this weekend. Take your bets as to what will happen. And don't cheat. Don't go on Wikipedia. Don't be an F1 YouTuber. You've got about 47 seconds before this race is going to start, so take your best guess. Got it? Conditions for qualifying were atrocious. Rain fell upon the circuit at the start of the session, but by the end of it, it was upgraded to a flood. Now, the way qualifying worked back in 2005 was that each car went out one at a time. Each driver had the track all to themselves and had only one lap to string it together and place their car on the grid. The order in which they went out was determined by reverse order of where they placed in the previous Grand Prix. What this meant was that, thanks to the worsening weather, the leaders of the pack watched helpless as the track conditions became worse and worse and worse. And by the time they went out, the aim for them had switched from setting a fast lap time to making sure they didn't drown. Ralf Schumacher in the Toyota would take pole position, while Jenson Button in the BAR would line up on the front row as well in second place. The new world champion and Alonso was down in 16th place, right near the tail end. All the while, his teammate Giancarlo Fisichella was in third, the only one of the top cars to be up at the pointy end. The only other driver to set a slower lap time than Alonso was the McLaren of Kimi Räikkönen. Aside from Alonso, Räikkönen had arguably been the best driver that year. Some astonishing drives, including 6 wins in his McLaren, could have made him a genuine threat for the title. And he would have been, had his McLaren not shaken itself to bits almost every time it was sent out. What was perhaps more annoying was that, toward the latter half of the year, the MP4-20 had become the fastest car on the grid, and the reliability woes were virtually ironed out. But it was too little, too late. Had things gone differently, he might very well have been able to challenge Fernando for the championship. But, as we know, hypotheticals mean nothing when it comes to winning actual championships. As it was, those two were first and second in the championship, but both virtually last on the grid, with the exception of these 3 drivers, who neglected to hand in their permission slips on time. With the grid so shaken up, no one was quite so sure what to expect. I mean, like I said, no one really expects much of a race out of the circuit. It is hard to pass here as it is, and the aero wash that you get with modern day F1 cars makes moving through the pack almost impossible. Whatever the case, in just a few seconds, we'd know the answer. The lights went out, and Alonso was immediately on a mission, passing cars around him as if they were standing still. His charge had already begun. Up at the front, Ralf Schumacher started to make use of his 15 minutes of fame and sped off into an early lead. But the man starting beside him, Jenson Button, had a secret weapon in hand, for he was given full rich engine settings for this race by Honda. And he made use of this by immediately losing second place and coming under attack from the Red Bulls, who at that time were not much good. Button's teammate, Takuma Sato, also had a laggy start. And then it got worse, understeering wide into the sandbox right in front of his hometown crowd. To add insult to injury, Rubens Barrichello in the Ferrari went off in sympathy, bumping into him on his way to the beach and forcing them both into the pits. What's perhaps a little ironic is that Barrichello would end up replacing Sato at this team for the next year. To the fans in the crowd, watching the local boys sparring through the dunes was less than ideal, but there was no reason for them to leave their seats because up ahead, a lot was happening. Alonso was scything through the pack with the ferocity of a raccoon on angel dust. By the end of the first lap, he had gone from 16th on the grid to 8th. Scintillating progress, especially on a track like this. Räikkönen was also romping through, albeit a little more ruggedly. He ran wide at the Casio triangle and lost a bunch of positions. As they began the second lap of the race, however, his teammate, Juan Pablo Montoya, ran even wider. It was said that if a McLaren or a Renault failed to finish the race, it would likely hand the Constructors' Championship over to the other team. So, for Montoya to be stranded by the side of the road, surrounded by bits of what used to be his Formula 1 car, kind of sealed McLaren's fate, especially given how Fisichella was up the front, and Alonso was bound to join him soon. Never mind that it was Jacques Villeneuve who ran him wide. It's a very strange place to try and attempt to pass. A bruised ego is always better than a literal bruised body. Or car. But not for Montoya. Evidently, Räikkönen was effectively a one-man band again. Whatever McLaren were going to achieve today, he was gonna have to do it all by himself. The safety car was brought out, duh, and the cars pootled around for a few laps, while shards of carbon fiber and Montoya's ego were scraped off the track. 6 laps later, we were back racing. Ralf Schumacher made the most of his restart and ran away from Fisichella, but the Red Bulls behind them were still fast asleep, and Michael Schumacher in the Ferrari began to round them up. Alonso followed in close pursuit. He did have a slight issue with the Red Bull of Christian Klein, but when all was said and done, he led him back past, then repassed him, all within the confines of the pit straight, which was a little bit strange. I thought this thing wasn't allowed, like, I don't know, Belgium 2008. Well, anyway, after disposing of Klein, Alonso was now ranging up behind Schumacher. The Lord of the Eyebrows was absolutely flying. And then, as they accelerated onto the front straight to begin lap 10, Alonso fell behind. He had slowed right down, almost as if his car had a problem. And then mysteriously, as Klein went back past him, Alonso found his speed again. What we didn't know at the time was that while the Renault team had read the rulebook and probably understood it, the FIA governing body weren't so sure that that earlier move on Klein was totally legal. So, Renault radioed Alonso and told him to give the place back to Klein, only for the FIA to then say,
Nah, actually, it's alright.
Ineptitude in the motor racing governing body is not a new thing. To try to make sense of them is like trying to get out of the friend zone. Still though, at least they weren't as inept as some of the other clowns that were racing there that weekend. Antonio Pizzoni's day was done when he threw his Williams off at Degner, and Sato, in his desperate bid to impress the hierarchy at Honda, threw his car into the side of Jarno Trulli and took him out of the race. It was a bloody clumsy move, and the stewards rewarded him with disqualification. Meanwhile, up ahead, Alonso had gotten back past Klein. However, the time lost to Schumacher was not needed, and now, teammate Fisichella was leading the race after it was revealed that Toyota had pulled the ultimate Fugazi with Ralf Schumacher's fuel. This was an age where refueling was allowed, and drivers would be starting on different amounts of fuel. Toyota tried a big Hail Mary, wanting those 10 laps of glory, leading their home race. Now they were brought back to reality, leaving Toyota no alternative but to watch their hopes slip away once again, because Fisichella was running away and looking more and more set for victory. It looked for all the world that, despite the almighty pace of Alonso and Räikkönen, this was Fisichella's race to lose. And that was kind of a good thing. He had not won a race since the very start of the year. All the while, his teammate had won 6. He had played second fiddle for so long, been told that he wasn't even in the same universe as his teammate. Now here he was, with an opportunity to redeem himself in some way, shape or form. Alonso, meanwhile, had caught Schumi up again. He was absolutely hounding the rear of the Ferrari. It wasn't so much a question of if he could get past, but when. The Casio triangle or the hairpin would have been a likely place for most drivers, but Fernando Alonso isn't most drivers. Passing the 7-time world champion around the outside of 130R. Everyone watching completely stunned with what they had just seen. Alonso had done a lot already to become the 2005 champion, but this was an inspired drive. He was lapping a 1.5 seconds faster than anyone else on the track. If he could keep this up, Fisichella really didn't stand a chance. And while Alonso managed to dispatch of Schumi, Räikkönen just couldn't. For lap after lap, the McLaren was left stranded behind the Ferrari, unable to forge his way past despite his best best efforts, but when the pit stop cycle sorted itself out, rather amazingly, Schumi and Kimi found themselves back ahead of Alonso, and a few laps after that, Kimi finally found his way past Schumacher, going around the outside into turn 1, a move that mere mortals could only dream about pulling off. Not far behind them was, of course, Fernando, but despite the sheer speed he had shown in the race, he just couldn't find a way past the Ferrari, whilst Räikkönen was shrinking further and further into the distance. He eventually worked his way past, and when he did, he began to catch back up again. Alonso was on fire. Räikkönen was on fire too, and down the pack, rather surprisingly, Christian Albers in the Minardi was on fire too. No, really, he was on fire. With around 15 laps to go, Fisichella made his last pit stop, and by now, the gap was such that even a Herculean drive from either Räikkönen or Alonso wouldn't be enough to haul him in. All that was needed from Fisichella was for him to hold up his end of the bargain and drive to the number that Renault demanded of him. Unfortunately, he wasn't, and Räikkönen was hauling more ass than a truck full of donkeys. Eventually, it came time for him to make his last pit stop of the race. Fueled, serviced, out. With 8 laps to go, the gap between Fisichella and Räikkönen was 9 seconds. But even if he somehow managed to pull it off, catching a driver is one thing, but passing is quite another, especially around here, where passing requires courage, bravery, or madness. Most drivers certainly wouldn't try passing in the grass at this place, or any place for that matter, although, again, Fernando Alonso ain't most drivers. You would think that Alonso was driving for the fate of the world here. In reality, he was merely taking away a podium from the Williams of Mark Webber. Quite what goes through the mind of a man who's willing to pull these moves off when he's already the world champion goes beyond comprehension. But I guess that is why he became the world champion in the first place, and why his teammate faltered for the vast majority of the year, even in circumstances like today, even when everyone else was starting at the very back. Yes, Fisichella did look as though he had this race in the bag, but with 3 laps to go, his mirrors showed him a rather unnerving sight. Thanks to an absent-minded Robert Dornbos in a backmarker Minardi, Räikkönen was now right on Fisi's tail. What was needed now from Giancarlo was to keep a cool head and drive smart. Instead, heading into Casio, he defended when he didn't need to. This compromised his run onto the straight, and now Kimi was right on his gearbox. He was under attack. He drew closer and closer, but he would survive this time. With 2 laps to go, there isn't much opportunity left for Kimi. As each corner passes, Fisichella nudges closer and closer to victory. Now the pressure starts to shift ever so slightly to the McLaren driver. He probably also remembered that he had lost races this year on the last lap owing to a lack of reliability. Sure, by this time, the car had gotten a lot better, but still, could this damn thing just keep itself together to the end even? Those thoughts went away, however, when, once again, Fisichella defended aggressively into the final chicane. Having seen this episode before, Kimi lined himself up for an attack onto the straight for the final lap. Fisi desperately attempted to defend, weaving across the track. Millimeters apart, Kimi darted to the outside, sent it deep. I'm sure that some of you have heard the term Prime Kimi Räikkönen, about how in the early 2000s he was an absolute demon behind the wheel, worlds apart from the driver we saw toward the end of his career. All this is true, and this race proved all of that, coming from the very back of the grid to take victory with some of the most audacious moves you'd ever see from an F1 driver. In short, he was the best in the world on his day, and this was his day. This was all him. This was Prime Kimi Räikkönen. This is why his name is steeped in legend. But while it was all jubilation for him, McLaren, and Ron Dennis, Renault were not at all happy. Just last year, they had fired one of their drivers for butchering a podium in almost the same manner. But this was a race win, and the Constructors' Championship on the line. It seems that Fisichella might be en route to meet the same fate. Well, as it would turn out, he wouldn't. They actually tried to shelter him from any blame for losing that race right at the end. And ultimately, it didn't matter too much. Renault would become the Constructors' Champions in the final round in Shanghai. But whatever the case, this race was easily the best of the year and remains one of the greatest in Formula One's history overall. There have been a lot of crappy races over the years where the monotonous task of staying up late or getting up early to watch a procession starts to wear thin. But sometimes you get an absolute gem. Watching this race, time flew by. As for the large part, we were watching pure racing, truly courageous driving, without the need for DRS or a Netflix crew curse. And it happened here. at Suzuka, a track not really regarded as a hotbed for great racing. Yet, as the checkered flag fell, you couldn't help but agree when James Allen remarked this was Grand Prix racing at its absolute finest.